So in the next couple of videos, we're going to be looking at fonts basically on your website. At the moment, what we've been doing is we've been using the default font set by the browser. So for example, if I head over here and just type in test into my body, I've got no stars at all on here. In actual fact, we'll put this into a paragraph element. And let's refresh, let's inspect this. And let's go ahead over to the computed styles, and you see here that for the rendered fonts we've got Times Roman. So we're using a default font here. Maybe we want to change this. Now the first thing I'm going to do is inside of main.css I'm going to create a body selector, and I'm going to change the font in this way. Now I'm not going to delve too much into font sizing, because that's a sort of responsive design problem really. It's not a good idea to set your font sizes in pixels. I'm going to set mine in ems. This does allow for some kind of, rems are obviously better. But what we're going to do later on is we're going to let Foundation 5, which is a front-end framework, handle the typography for us. This is much better because it's a community-driven project, and it's open source, and it's much easier than doing all this yourself. But we'll be looking at that more in depth later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the font on the body. This will set pretty much not everything, and we'll look at what doesn't get set in just a moment. This will set pretty much everything to the font that you specify. You can see here that we can set things like font size, font style, font weight, and font family. Font style is things like italic. Font weight is things like bold, or you can set specific weight, so like 800 or 700. And if you don't know what that means, we'll look later at these different weights when we use the Google Fonts API. Or we can use font family, which is basically which font you want to use. So for example, I'm going to say Arial, font family Arial. Now you don't have to put these in double quotes, but if it's something like Times New Roman, we then have gaps, and you can see that the syntax highlighting already is breaking, so we put these in double quotes. Now, when we choose things, when we choose certain fonts, we have things like serifs and sans serifs. So for example, Times New Roman is a serif font. So we put basically a fallback, and we can do as many fallbacks as we want here. So when I refresh now, oops. Yeah, so we haven't really changed the font. When I do Arial, that says sans serif. There we go. So we basically changed the font size, the font style there. I could, of course, just say sans serif like that, and it just does pretty much the same thing. But I'm setting this to Arial, and I'm falling back to sans serif if this Arial isn't available. But you can do other font fallbacks as well. So you could do something like Verdana if you wanted to. So then if Arial isn't available, then Verdana would take its place. So that's a little bit about sort of typography theory. I'm not going to go too much into it because it's not my area of expertise. I think typography is a whole nother level of learning. But let's stick with just Arial for now, and we'll just sort of ignore the fact that Arial is probably not the best font to use on a website. Please be really careful when you pick fonts, and we'll talk about that later when we pull in fonts from sites like Font Squirrel and Google Fonts API, which is my personal favourite. So this has changed the paragraph element. If we get rid of the paragraph element, you can see that the text is still that font. So anything within the body pretty much. If we create a div element and we create some lorem ipsum in there, and we head over here, that text has been changed still. If we create an anchor with click me, that is also going to take the font that you give it. However, we have a couple of caveats here, and we're going to look at building up forms later, but I'm going to create an input here with a type of text, which is essentially a form field that you would insert something into. And just for comparison, let's put a paragraph element just up here, and let's put some lorem ipsum in there. So we've got some lorem ipsum, we've got our input. Let's zoom in. I'm going to type something in here. And you can see that not only is the font size different, but also the font style. Actually, no, is the font style different? Either way, it's not consistent. So basically what you would want is you would want consistency here. So the body has a font family of Arial. We've not given this a font size. We've not given the body a generic font size. So what we can actually do is we can use the shorthand font property for this. So we can say 1M Arial sans serif. No comma here, only a comma for these. And you can also put bold in here as well. But go ahead and look up the font shorthand. So in here we have the same problem. So what I tend to do is we say body. You might have separate body styles, by the way. So you wouldn't want to include this in you know, if you were doing like a background of, I don't know, black, if you were really doing that, and the color of white, that would obviously give us this result. But you wouldn't then say input like that just because you wanted to apply this font to the input, because then you would end up with a black input with white text in. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these out, and if you really did need them, you would then just put them in a separate body. Understandably, you are duplicating the selector, but you are then specifically tying these styles to these elements, so that doesn't really matter. So the body and input have a font of 1M Arial, and now we have consistency between our inputs and our outer elements. So that's one thing to look out for, that inside of inputs and text areas, you won't have consistency. In fact, particularly text areas, if we actually do create a text area element here, which you've probably seen on a website before, it's basically an area where a user can enter text into. So like this, Alex, hello there, like so. I think by default, if we just get rid of all of that, there is, in fact, it's not showing on my browser, but I think sometimes you actually get a sort of monospace font. So monospace, let's get rid of that. You would get something that looks a little bit like that inside of a text area by default. It might not be the case on OS X. But nevertheless, you could then also say text area, and then you could have a text area there, and you could have an input there, and they would then both look the same. So it's a good idea to sort of play around with that. Like I said, we'll look at text areas a bit later. Now this is all well and good, but what happens if you want to include a really nice web-friendly font that you know, is really popular, really easy to read, great for headers, and maybe a separate one that's great for body text? Well, we're going to get rid of all of this, and we're going to utilize the help of an external website. And this is Font Squirrel. Now there are plenty of websites around that allow you to download web font kits, but this is just one that lists quite a few and quite popular ones, and it's pretty good to do. There are some that are paid, but you know, that's just life. So I've chosen one called Amble. I'm just going to use this to change my header fonts on my website. So I'm just going to say, well, I think that would look nice as a header font. So I'm going to go ahead and change this. So you can see here that by clicking on Amble from just the sort of main page here, I can test drive it. I can look at specimens. I can look at all of these. I can see, does it look nice as body, or does it look nice as header, blah, blah, blah. And I get this web font kit. Now, Web Font Kit contains various font formats that work for different browsers and different devices. So here it actually lists them for us, which is pretty useful. So TTF works in most browsers except IE and iPhone. EOT is specifically for IE only, and WOFF, Compressed Emerging Standard, SVG for iPhone and iPad. So as long as you've included all of these, you're pretty much covered. So what we do is we download the @FontFace kit, and that is actually a CSS not property, but it's a CSS font face, and we'll look at how we implement this as well. Once you've downloaded that, you'll get something like the following. So you will get the EOT, the SVG, the TTF, and the WOFF. And you'll also get, oh, what's that? No, you'll also get the demo here. This is what I'm after. We're not going to click on the demo, but we are going to look at the style sheet. But the first thing I want to do is I want to create a new folder inside of the directory that I'm working in. And I'm going to call this fonts. And I'm then going to take the 4 font files and I'm going to copy them over to that fonts directory. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the style sheet in here, and that's going to give me the basically the code already. But I am going to talk to you a little bit about how this works. So let's copy this, and we do need to make a couple of adjustments to this. So inside of our main.css, we'll place this here. Now what this doesn't do is it doesn't apply this font to any particular element. All we're doing with this font face here is we're saying we have a font, we want to call it Amble Regular. We could call this Cats for all we care. We're saying Amble Regular, and we're saying source, but we're providing multiple sources. Now we have things in here like IE fixes, which are basically it's basically a little hack that we do to fix this on Internet Explorer. I'm not quite sure of the problem. But then we give a format, and we have a URL here as well. We have a URL. So we have multiple comma-separated URLs for each of these formats that work across different browsers and devices. And we can set things like the font weight and the font style. Now in this case, I've chosen specifically the regular font. So for the font weight and style, we don't want to change them. We'll be looking at font weight when we get to using the Google Fonts API, which allows us to easily integrate different weights dynamically. And that's really, really exciting. So we've got our font family called Amble Regular. All we need to do now is sort of say, well, which font family do we want to use? Well, in this case, we can just say body, font family, like that. Or we don't really need the double quotes here because it's just all one word. So now what's going to happen is when we refresh, we now have that font available for everything on our body. So I'm just going to create a paragraph here with some lorem ipsum in. And there we go. Oh, right. So, cool. I've caught myself out, but this is a really, really good point. Now, what's not happening is these aren't being loaded in. And there's a good reason for that. If we inspect the element here, you can see that we've actually got in our console. So if you can't see this thing here, either hit this little button here or hit the console at the bottom. That should just bring this up for you. Oh, no, sorry. Hit this little toggle here. That will bring it up for you. It says file not found, and if we hit the network tab and refresh, we'll see the same thing as well. These requests, these files can't be found. The reason they can't be found is we are currently, if we have a look, inside the CSS directory. What we need to do is jump back a directory, then into our fonts directory to find these fonts. So if we look in our Finder again, just close that off, we're in the CSS directory. We need to come back a directory into fonts, and then we can access these files. So we do that like we would normally, anywhere. If you're aware of this, you do /fonts / and then the font name. So we're going out of the CSS directory using this into the fonts, and there we go. So I'm just going to apply that to each one of these, like so. And then when we come down and refresh, that's been applied to the body. The WOFF has been chosen in this case. That's been loaded in, and we'll talk about a little bit about the speed of fonts in a moment, and that has been applied. Cool. So let's just zoom out to 100%. Personally, I think this would look better as a header font. So what I'm going to do is, instead of applying this to the body, I'm going to apply this to each of the headers down to header 5. And I'm going to say font family, or I'm going to say font. I'll say font family, and we'll choose this. There we go. Refresh, and I'm going to then apply, let's say we have an article here, and we have a header 1. This is an article, and then we just have a paragraph with some lorem ipsum, and maybe another paragraph with some lorem ipsum. There we go. So what we can actually do with this now is we can start to play around with it, and we can add more CSS properties. So we can say text, decoration, text transform, uppercase. And there we go. So we've transformed it uppercase. I guess that's another really cool CSS property to know, that it's semantically incorrect technically to do this. This is an article in capitals, because it's not right. It shouldn't. It's not semantically correct. Like I said, you should use that for the sort of presentation layer. Should deal with that. So this is an article, then we've got our normal body text. So we've now integrated a web font. You can find these absolutely anywhere. Just have a Google around. But beware that by loading in a font, you are making an additional HTTP request, and it is making use of downloading this file. You can see that it's taken 1 millisecond to download it. Not too bad, but again, consider people on lower connections, particularly if you're loading lots of fonts in. What you want to try and do with web development in terms of the front end is you want to have as limited fonts as possible, just to avoid sort of visual confusion. You can have a font for the header, and then you can have a font for body content, and then just leave it at that, really, just rather than loading in lots of different fonts for this heading and that heading and another heading and the footer and the header. It just makes things a lot, it's not going to look nice, and it's going to load in so many files. So this is quite cool. We've looked at loading in fonts, web fonts, and we've looked at applying them to the page, and we've learnt how to use the font face to pull in those particular fonts and then go ahead and apply them to certain elements, and you can add them to any element you want.